Hi, this is Ben Schwellen. Today I'm talking about the Welsh language and the Dutch language. How similar are those two languages? What are some of their differences and how are they like each other? One thing that helps you learn a language is looking at other languages and how they fit in relation to it. Dutch is from the Germanic branch of the indo-European family, and Welsh is from the Celtic branch of that family. So they are related, but how do these two branches of the Indo-European family relate to each other? First of all, we know for certain that Celtic and Latin are much closer to each other than Celtic is to Germanic. Like Slavic and Baltic are much closer to each other than they are to Germanic. Germanic's a bit of an outlier in the Indo-European family. It underwent changes that were not reflected in the other languages of this big family group. There were sound shifts that marked it out as being different, and you'll see that as we go ahead in this. Historically, Celtic is much earlier testified because of its interaction with Rome, which was damaging to it long term, but much more of Celtic's later variations in Gaulish and Brythonic were testified. A lot later of what early Dutch became was written down, but we have much more evidence of the early bits of Welsh than we do than the early bits of Dutch. Where are these two languages spoken? Well, Dutch is spoken in the Netherlands and in Belgium and small bits elsewhere like in South America. Welsh is spoken in Wales on the western side of the Isle of Britain, and ironically in South America as well, by a very small number of people in Argentina. So these two languages have very different landscapes. The Netherlands is famous for low-lying land and rivers and sailing and shipping. Wales is heavily mountainous, and that's affected its culture. So the geography of these two languages is already very different. The Welsh is a minority language. Dutch is a majority language, and that gives you a different perspective in terms of your psychology. But what about the languages themselves? Germanic and Celtic branched off in different ways from Indo-European. The sound shifts that created different branches of that language had different traits. So for example, T at the beginning in Germanic often went D in Celtic. And then you have several groups of letters where, in terms of sound, the letter in Indo-European, Celtic went one way and German went the opposite. So P often became a F sound in Germanic, and a B or a softer P sound in Celtic languages, which gave rise to something called mutations, which you don't need to go into here, but letters change. And this shifting off from the Indo-European language is what would eventually produce that in Celtic languages, in terms of being able to change consonants to determine meaning. But in Germanic, the sound change became consonant clusters. Don't quote my pronunciation of these in Dutch, by the way. So these letters went different ways. The hard K with a W sound after it, qua, this became gwa gradually in Germanic, and then the G was dropped off and then it was a hua with an H sound in front of it, like the word what, who. And this carried into Dutch today. You have the hua sound in these question words. And in Welsh, it went the other way. It went puh. So you have pwy, meaning who. You have pa beth, what thing, became beth. And a lot of these P words in Welsh became B sounding words. So these are two very different directions, B and W, that the question sounds became in these two languages. You have words like the word for wolf, and it was a B or a V sound in Proto-Indo-European. And when it branched off, the Celts went down the B changing into a V sound, which you get today in the mutations in Welsh. It's a BL. But in the Germanic, you get this W and V sound. So it's related distantly, but you carry that forward, that difference in sound between many different words in these two languages. You get S endings, and this became a double D often in Welsh today, which makes a F sound, or a Z sound in Breton. for further south. But in Germanic, you get more of an NS kind of sound, sometimes just an S. BL or double L in modern day Welsh. And then in the Germanic way, it went completely the other way. You get FL, a full sound. But they do have commonalities here. Some of these words that are beginning with BL in Germanic are also beginning with BL in Celtic. The Germanic language, or the Proto-Germanic language, we don't really have much of a solid idea. We know when it began to break up, and certainly by 500 BC, there was emerging different dialects which would become different Germanic languages. But we don't have so much of a solid idea just because there's not as much evidence going further north beyond what was then civilization. There was more evidence regarding the Celts. But what about the language itself? Well, there are cognates today from this early Indo-European period. Take the word to shine. In Welsh you have glowy, which is more of an emanating kind of shine. But in Dutch you have glansen. And you can see that this is a cognate, obviously. Going back to that double L and FL sound that I mentioned, you have the word for a flood or a flow in Welsh, llif, with that double L, and then high tide in Dutch, flood, which gives us English flood. But those two are related. That FL becoming double L you get in Shakespeare. So he mentions Llewellyn becomes Fluellen. So people had this idea from the English point of view that that's what that double L was. And maybe it was this subconscious awareness of these cognates that spurred that understanding of that sound being that. Floor is the Dutch word for floor. So obviously it's close to English, but it's closer to Welsh than you might think. Llawer. That FL sound really embeds itself there into that double L. And you'll see this in quite a few places in reference to words that would begin with that VL, which is FL sound in Dutch. The Indo-European reconstruction of the word for flower is vlos or blos. And the words for both of these languages for flower, bloden and bloemen. That's really similar, and that obviously shows you how much that ancient word for flower has continued today in both these languages. The word for thorn, drynen, doorn. That's that Indo-European root again, because the word for thorn in Indo-European was something like turna. And again, that T sound and that D, you're going to see that interchange throughout Indo-European languages, shifting in and out of each other. So you get the word for tooth in Welsh, dant. But in Dutch, it's actually spelled the exact inverse of what it is in Welsh, even though you pronounce it quite a bit like the Welsh one, tant. It's the T sound at the end. Isn't that interesting? Because it didn't really branch off a different word. They branched off the same word for tooth. Tooth is one of those that's, if languages are related, they're usually quite similar. Goose. In Welsh, gwydd. And in Dutch, gans. And you can see how that S at the end of Dutch corresponds to the double D ending, like I mentioned earlier with those sound shifts between Celtic and Germanic in connection to their old Indo-European root. The word for wind, wind in Dutch, gwent in Welsh. The word for cheese, kaas in Welsh, kaas in Dutch. The word for niece, neath in Welsh, nicht in Dutch. So there's all these European cognates. Look at this one here though, where you get a similar word for a similar type of thing. So boom is the word for tree in Dutch, but the word for the base of a tree is stump is born. So it's not quite the same thing, but you can see how it became that over time. And when you're learning a language that's related as far apart as these are, that's really what you're going to have to look for to find similar words. They're that different that they don't have that many words that are the same. Let's look at the numbers in these two languages to see how similar and different they are, because numbers are one of the first things you learn in any language, right? Don't quote my pronunciation of these in Dutch, by the way. So, ein and een in Welsh. That's really similar, and that's quite common across Indo-European languages. For two, you have twee and die in Welsh, or dwy. And you can see how that D and T are intermingling again. And again in the third one, drie for Dutch and tri for Welsh. So the D and the T switch again. You're going to see this all over the place in these two languages. Four, vier, and then pedwar in Welsh. There's that P and F I talked about in the Indo-European stuff. 5, pimp in Welsh, and vijf in Dutch. So you have that P and F sound again. Zes for 6 and chwech. That's not really that similar, but you can see where it came from. 7, scythe. Again, not so similar, but you can see where it came from. And acht and uith. That's interesting that you have that soft TH sound in Welsh and that soft kind of gentle guttural CH in Dutch. And then 9, negen, and now. You can see where that comes from. And then in 10, again, you have this D and T flipping around. 10 in Dutch and dag in Welsh. Hey, if you're liking this video, hit that like button. And what other languages would you like me to compare to Welsh? One thing that I find really peculiar about a similarity in both these languages is the negative indefinite form. What do I mean by that? Let me show you what I mean and how they form negatives in both these languages. So look at these two sentences. Ligt geen fles onder het bed. There is not a bottle under the bed. And in Welsh, nid oes potol o dan y gwely. You can say as well, does dim potol o dan y gwely. Both are okay. Does dim is a bit less formal. But also what's interesting here is onder and odan. Both of the words for under in both these languages have a D and an N sound in them. I also want to bring to your attention ligt, which is literally there is not laying a bottle under the bed. Many times in Dutch you have to convey the geographic position that an object is in order to explain where it is. If it's sitting, laying, standing. You don't have that in Welsh. But in Welsh you do have some cases in terms of transaction. A house is on rent or on lease. Something is on having for availability. Argail. Arosod. So that's the indefinite negative. What about the definite negative? Have a look at this. The sword is not shining. Het zwaard glinstert niet in Dutch. And in Welsh, neither cleddyf yn sglenio or der cleddyf ddim yn sglenio. So there's two big similarities there. You have the word the, which many languages don't. And the word for shining or conveying that sense has a GL sound in it somewhere. So there's a lot that is similar between Welsh and Dutch. It's not just learning a language where it's going to be so alien to you, you don't even know what's going on from Welsh or Dutch to the other. One thing that I found that threw me a bit coming in Dutch from a Welsh speaking perspective is the EN ending in Dutch. In Welsh, that's a singular ending. Llwyren, a satellite. It's usually a feminine singular ending in Welsh. Amlen, envelope. Kangen, a branch. But in Dutch, it's plural. So book becomes boeken. It's the exact opposite. House, huizen, from huis. Duif, Dove becomes duven. And notice that the Z sound changes from the S sound and the V sound changes from the F sound. That is that Indo-European thing going on again. Dutch does have the S plural like you have in English quite often. Welsh does too, especially with loan words. So in Dutch, meisje, a girl, meisjes, girls. Welsh plurals are much more varied than you get in Dutch. So you have these endings, just to name a few. And you also get the middle of words that change. So gaver, goat, becomes gaver. Both of these languages have a perfect past tense and a past tense. What do I mean by that? Perfect past tense means that you've more or less just done it, usually. And past tense is that it happened in the past. And both of these languages add something before the word to convey that. However, Dutch attaches it to the word, which is different to Welsh. Welsh has wedi, which just means that it happened. Wedi digwydd, happened. Ik heb gezwommen. Don't quote my pronunciation on these in Dutch. And in Welsh, dwi wedi nofio. So that GE in Dutch conveys the wedi that you have in Welsh. If you want to talk about it being more solidly in the past, ik zwom. And in Welsh, nofiais I. It sounds a bit more formal sometimes in Welsh to say that, but I prefer being a bit more formal. It sounds a bit more pompous. Let's look at one more about the past. Je hebt een sneeuwwerk gemaakt. Means you have made a carving. And in Welsh, that would be rwyt ti wedi gwneud nafiad. So that GE at the beginning really does correspond to the wedi word in Welsh. And then if you want to have this past tense, not perfect, je maakte een sneeuwwerk. You made a carving. Gwnes nafiad. You made a carving. In English, we sometimes say you have made, but we don't differentiate so specifically between that perfect and past as both Dutch and Welsh do. Showing ownership is essential to learning any language. How you say he has his car, or it is her house, etc., etc. And every language has a different way of showing ownership. It's called the genitive. So how do both of these languages do that? Let's look at this sentence. De sleutel van de deur ontbreekt. It means the door's key is lost. And in Welsh, mae allwedd y drws ar goll. So in Dutch there you have that word van between the object and the subject. But in Welsh, you just place one after the other. Allwedd y drws, the door's key. All you do is place whoever or whatever owns it after the object. Let's look at another one. Het is het raam van Bronwen. Fennes de Bronwen ydy. This means it is Bronwen's window. And so Bronwen's window, het raam van Bronwen. You have to put that van there really to show ownership. In Welsh, you just have to put Bronwen after what she owns. So you convey this in two different ways between these languages. That's just a taster into the basics of both these languages and how they're a bit similar in some cases and completely different in others. Just looking at a few basic sentences, you can see that it's in no way mutually intelligible. So you're going to have to come at it both grammatically and vocabulary from an entirely new viewpoint. But there's going to be core similarities just because of how close it is on the Indo-European spectrum. But it is at different ends of the Indo-European spectrum because of how Latin and Celtic broke off more towards their own branch almost at one point than Germanic, which is a very different branch of that family. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and hey, hit that like button, and if you have any questions, hey, put that down in the comments below and we can talk about that.